Today in Stronger Than Reason, we thread the needle between the classic sci-fi novel Roadside Picnic and its popular film adaptation, Stalker. Welcome to Stronger Than Reason. It was inevitable that that would happen sooner or later. And now for something completely different. A book and a film. Yes, this show tends towards music, namely the electronic, industrial, and alternative music of the Gen X vintage, which is, of course, my own vintage, and a fine vintage it is. But I figure, why restrict the show to just music? I don't really see the point. I've already tackled some other adjacent topics like making music in episode 40 and podcasting in episode 50 and generative AI in episode 70 and so on. So we've already had some discursions from time to time, talking not so much about music, but other kinds of art. And speaking of art, I think the art created during my formative years and those of my fellow Gen Xers during the 70s and 80s was pretty unique. Of course, any generation can say that. They can say, oh, our art is very unique. And that's true, I'm sure, and fine. But I think the 70s and 80s were unprecedented in some ways. We lived day to day under the threat of imminent nuclear annihilation, thanks to the Cold War. Strangely, though, the U.S. after 1973 was a time of relative peace. It was post-Vietnam and pre-war on terror, excepting a few skirmishes here and there, like in Lebanon, Iran, El Salvador, Libya, the Sinai, Grenada, Honduras, the Persian Gulf, and Panama. But other than that, peaceful. Also, it was a time of rapid technological development because the miniaturization of electronic components drove innovation in personal computing, in digital devices of all kinds, which of course led to massive consumerism, not to mention the eventual rise of home internet access and increased communication, all of which maybe contributed to a kind of growing anxiety, a digital paranoia of sorts, a sense that things were maybe changing too fast in ways that we weren't ready for. And I can remember the headlines in January of 1984 asking if we'd be living in the novel by the year's end. And it might have been easy to laugh that off at the time as a joke, but I think it did indicate an uneasiness that was maybe justified because, of course, these days, we've all chosen to carry telescreens on us 24/7. So it seemed clear we were moving into some kind of new age, maybe an information age with the information superhighway, but no one really knew what that meant or what it would look like. But for sure, the media started to reflect these changes in ways that were unfathomable just 30 years prior. So books and films imagined the future as a post-apocalyptic hellscape. Music began to incorporate electronic devices like synthesizers, drum machines, and samplers. And filmmakers found new ways of blending and editing media to astonish us with unforeseen special effects. A lot of this art focused on the question, what is our place in this new world? How will we fit into a society that's computerized and automated? One where the jobs we've traditionally done are no longer important, where most people, in fact, will earn a living in this thing called a cubicle, talking to other people on a telephone or a computer, rather than in real life. How would that affect our day-to-day life? Or for that matter, how would it affect our humanity? So keep in mind, the 70s began with the United States landing people on the moon, so it seemed reasonable to assume that we would soon have a permanent residence there, and that Mars and the rest of the solar system weren't far off. And I was a little too young to remember Skylab, but I do remember reading about it afterward in first or second grade or so because it was on the cover of my weekly reader, and it captured my imagination because as a kid, I was obsessed with two things, dinosaurs and space. And thinking critically about it, I realized that probably only one of these things were going to be part of my future. And that weekly reader seemed to confirm that one day soon my classmates and I would wind up in space and nothing could have made me happier at the time. So, side note, one of my childhood dreams was to see the surface of Pluto, and it used to drive me crazy. All we had were these little smudgy pictures showing just a white dot, and I knew it had to look like something much cooler up close. Now, you might recall that we did end up sending a spacecraft to Pluto, the New Horizons probe, which, by the way, is still the fastest vehicle ever created so far, and it flew by Pluto in July of 2015. And I remember getting nervous as that day approached, because I was convinced I'd be stricken with a heart attack or a stroke, or maybe the camera would catastrophically fail just before the approach. Something terrible was going to happen to prevent this childhood dream from being fulfilled. But then I saw those first pictures, and all I could think was that, it looked a lot like the inside of my drip coffee maker, which, I realized was really dirty. Ew. So I did clean it, by the way. My coffee maker, that is, not Pluto. Anyway, much like I dwell on music from my early days, I also tend to go back and enjoy films and books from that time period. And I'm definitely not an expert in all that stuff, but I have a pretty good understanding of the major works. Every now and then, though, I'll come across something that I've never heard of before that really rings my bell, and I'll think, damn, how did I manage to miss that for so long, for so many decades? And I love it when that happens, because then I get to go on a deep dive into it, and more often than not, because this thing is decades old, there's all sorts of derivative and downstream works to check out along the way. So that happened to me recently, and in a pretty unexpected way. And oddly enough, it was through another YouTube channel. So the story is that I like to follow these crazy young guys who hop freight trains throughout Europe. And I don't know why. I guess maybe because I've never been to Europe, and I find it interesting to see the landscape. I think it's a bit more quaint in some ways than my region of the U.S., at least as far as rail travel is concerned. And maybe because of the adventure aspect of it, I suppose. Because they're doing stuff I would never do. I'm older now, of course. I'm more risk averse. But even back in the day, I'd never think it was a good idea to jump on a moving train and hitch across the country. For one thing, I like my comfort. For another, I like my arms and legs all attached to me. So there just wasn't really a point to it. There was no payback. And of course, these days, the payback is all in recording this nonsense with a GoPro and some drones and dumping it all on YouTube and Patreon for endless clicks and follows. So thanks to the internet, you can turn your personal risk into profit. Yes, you too can not only monetize your bad decisions, but thoroughly document them for the police. What a world. So naturally, these guys have thousands upon thousands of followers who, like me, get a kick out of their antics. And a few years ago, some of them went on a trip across the Ukraine into the Chernobyl exclusion zone. And for those who don't recall, Chernobyl was a nuclear reactor outside of Kiev that blew up in 1986, rendering the plant, the nearby town of Pripyat, and the surrounding countryside completely uninhabitable due to high radiation. Of course, these train surfer guys didn't ride trains into the zone. They hiked there, going cross-country and wading across streams, only to arrive in Pripyat with no electricity, running water, or help for miles around. Handheld Geiger counters were their only concession to personal safety. And you can still watch these films on YouTube, of course. A quick search will turn them up. Anyway, I was struck how in these videos, the guys would refer to other people in the zone as stalkers. And it seemed to me like a reference of some sort. And I figured since these guys were all 30 years younger than me, it must be just some young hip thing. But, I Googled it, as us unhip old people do, and presented with unfamiliar slang. And at first it seemed to be a reference to a video game, Stalker, s.t.a.l.k.e.r., which had since been franchised into a series, and I saw that it had something to do with running around a fictional version of the Chernobyl exclusion zone, going on missions, fighting mutants, collecting treasure and whatnot. So I figured, okay, that's fine. That's where it comes from. I'm not much of a video game guy. unless you're talking about the original arcade Donkey Kong. So it wasn't like I was going to go out and buy this Stalker game and play it. But further investigation pointed to an earlier reference, a movie called Stalker, made in Russia in 1979 and directed by Andrei Tarkovsky. So I started reading about that, and wow, it seemed much more up my alley because I love dark dystopian sci-fi. I have a huge collection of Philip K. Dick novels, for instance, not to mention stuff by William Gibson and Neil Stevenson. And I particularly like idea stories, so stories that start with a strange situation or premise and just kind of go from there. They're maybe not so character-based. The characters are there mostly just to explore this crazy circumstance they find themselves in. So some examples, okay, of these sorts of stories. What if suddenly the moon explodes? Well, that's just Neil Stephenson's Seven Eves. Or what if a drug could turn you into a completely different person? Well, that's just Philip K. Dick's A Scanner Darkly. And what if a kid's ability to play video games saved the planet? Well, that's Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game. And what if people just got stuck in an aquarium? Well, that's Stephen King's Under the Dome, and coincidentally, the Simpsons movie. So Stalker seemed like one of those idea stories from what I read, but more on the film in a bit, because I quickly sussed out that Stalker was itself an adaptation of an earlier work, a novel with the strange name of Roadside Picnic, which was written by the Russian sci-fi authors Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. Now, the Strugatskys happened to be brothers, and by 1972 they'd published nearly 20 novels, many of which were translated for the English-speaking market. So I figured Roadside Picnic was the place to start, the root for all of these various references. I didn't need to know much more about it other than that it was the inspiration for this film, which I hadn't seen, but that somehow mapped in a strange way to what was going on today with urban explorers in the real-life Chernobyl exclusion zone. So in other words, it seems suitably weird. So I picked up this paper copy for a good price, and it is a new English translation from 2012 by Olga Bormashenko, and I found it readable and enjoyable, although I noticed some of the terminology differs from earlier editions, judging from some of the online discussions I've read. Also, I gotta say, not the best binding in the world. The whole book is just a little concave, so when you open it, it kind of pops, which is kind of weird. And I don't like how the words in the page are like really close to the gutter here. You know, I'm really picky about that stuff. But the story is really good, so this book will do. It's also just a very short book. There's not much to it. I read it in just a couple of days. I enjoyed it a lot. It certainly was an idea book, but it did use a bunch of different characters to explore the human dimensions of the idea. And here is that idea. Here's the premise. Aliens visited the Earth, but they didn't stay. They just passed through. No one saw them. No one interacted with them. The places that they visited are called zones, and there are 6 around the Earth, but all the action here takes place in just one. And the book doesn't really say where it is. It doesn't really matter. But you might ask, what is the point of an alien story with no aliens? Well, the point is that they left things, artifacts of some kind, all of them with strange properties and unknown uses, and they're scattered around the zone. And half the fun of the novel is hearing about these things and wondering what they are, kind of making a catalog of them in your head as you're reading along. And for the most part, the story doesn't focus on them, at least not many of them. It just mentions them in various offhand ways without further elaboration, which just makes them more interesting. And then there's not just these physical things that were left behind, but also unexplainable phenomena. There's disturbances in the air and the earth. There's disturbances in probability. There's disturbances in physical forces like gravity and light and the second law of thermodynamics. There's disturbances in cause and effect. And some of these phenomena are also given fanciful names, just like you'd expect if they were experienced by people who weren't scientific, who weren't applying rigorous analysis, where all of their knowledge of these things was just passed along by hearsay, just as folklore. So that's the zone. And you might think, given this situation, that the National Guard would just come out and cordon the whole area off, just, make it impenetrable, if not for the safety of the public at large, then to hide the zone for the state's own private investigation. And it turns out that is what started happening in the story's history until a few people found uses for some of the artifacts, like batteries that could supply infinite power. And then overnight, the zone transformed from a place of fear into a place of potential wish fulfillment. And artifacts became lottery tickets that could potentially confer wealth, fame, or power. Thus, a black market inevitably formed. And experienced people were willing to guide others through the dangers of the zone to find lucrative items for a fee. They became a network of spies exchanging information with secret maps and lore changing hands. And entering the zone illegally became a high-risk, high-reward kind of operation. The guides became known as stalkers. Of course, to stalk has been an English verb for centuries, but the Strugatskys coined it in this new context, that of illicit guides in a forbidden territory, which of course led to its use in modern-day Chernobyl. So while this is going on, the government is of course running their own sanctioned research operation in the zone alongside the stalkers. And the main character is a fella named Red Shoehart, and he's someone who's playing both sides of the fence. He's helping the government, but he's also stalking on the side. And the book describes his trips into the zone in great suspenseful detail, all of the weird dangers involved, and the different ways that the government teams and the stalkers work to mitigate the risks. So there is an element in this book of problem solving, which I like in any sci-fi book. And that's what makes Andy Weir's work so compelling, having a protagonist who's forced to come up with a way around a series of baffling technical problems. So if you like The Martian, you might find something to like in Roadside Picnic. And I'm not going to spoil the book for you, but Red is compelled to continue stalking not just for himself, but to save his young daughter, because his trips to the zone have made her into a mutant, one who is slowly losing her humanity. So the plot really kind of takes off when Red hears of a unique artifact called the Golden Sphere that can grant wishes. And of course, we know what he'll wish for. He'll wish to save his daughter, heal his family, and thereby eliminate the need to ever risk his life in the zone again. And there's more to the story, of course. The book focuses on other characters, all of whom are grappling with their own motives for going into this place. One of them is a scientist, and it seems like his only reason for existence is to offer pages of exposition regarding the zone's impact on humanity. He kind of puts everything into context for one of the other characters as well as you, the reader. And, in his opinion, the visitation was nothing more than a roadside picnic for the aliens, hence the title. So they were no more aware of humans than humans on a picnic are aware of ants or other small critters. We're just nothing to them. And the artifacts that we find so miraculous were for them nothing more than garbage, like humans would leave empty cups and cigarette butts and candy wrappers laying around, things that are hardly worth thinking about. So in that sense, he paints a picture that, if you think about it, is actually pretty horrific. It's horrific to the people reading the story as well as those in it. It's a universe populated by beings that are not only vastly more powerful than us, but they are completely indifferent to us, and they are utterly incomprehensible. So in that sense, it's much the same as any H.P. Lovecraft story you'd ever care to read. And even though it's not really the Cthulhu mythos, it's got the same sort of grim outlook for humankind. So I read this quickly, partly because it's a very short book. It's just 200 pages, but partly because the plot was really compelling. I mean, it's just such a rich setup. I'm surprised there weren't any sequels to more fully explore the situation. But then you got to remember that this book was written in Soviet Russia in a time when terms like intellectual property and franchise rights weren't exactly at the forefront of the author's minds. So I can't imagine many more stories set in this world, following various stalkers and government agents who are all driven by various incentives, all of which are some kind of reflection on humanity and its own motives, some noble, some less so. And, then again, that's probably the niche that the Stalker video game series fills. Again, I'm not a gamer, so I know nothing about those, but I see that they've adapted the idea of the Stalker film by expressly making the zone the Chernobyl exclusion zone. So instead of aliens, all the weirdness is coming from radiation, I guess. And the games have some of the artifacts that were in the book, but have greatly expanded them, so that's pretty interesting. But if you like sci-fi, check out Roadside Picnic. I think it's a great read. I found it very much in the vein of Philip K. Dick, who was, after all, the Strugatsky's contemporary, and we know another master of the idea novel, as well as meta references and just crazy, unbelievable plot twists. And I'm sure I'll talk more about PKD in later episodes. But as far as the artifacts in here go, there is quite a lot of discussion in the book about this thing called an empty, which is just two copper discs set a foot or so apart, like two pieces of bread facing each other. But there's nothing in between them. And the weird thing is that there's no known force that can move these discs closer or farther apart. So they're linked in some unknown way. And the very first zone excursion in the book has to do with the government trying to track down this so-called full empty for research purposes. And it turns out to be an empty that has some blue fluid suspended between the discs. And all we know about it is that it's heavy enough for two people to barely be able to lift it. So some of the other artifacts include sponges and pins of unknown purpose, something called hell slime, which is this burning substance that converts nearly all other matter to more of itself. And then a lot of things are just described with these crazy names without further elaboration. So you got your burning fuzz, your rattling napkins, your lobster eyes, something called Dick the Tramp, and jolly ghosts. So again, half the fun is in just trying to imagine what these things are. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention this. The zone also reanimates the dead. So corpses buried in the zone come back to life. But unlike every zombie film you've ever seen, they're completely harmless. They just wander back to where they used to live and annoy the current residents by hanging around. So there's a lot more like weird and unexplainable stuff. Honestly, I love weird, imaginative, and mysterious things in books. Like, the more weird, the better. So if you have any recommendations, please give them to me. One of my favorite books ever is this, Dahlgren by Samuel R. Delany. I will eventually do a whole episode on this, or perhaps a series of episodes, because it is just chock full of weird, unexplained mysteries and is similar to Roadside Picnic in some ways. Maybe in the sense that it includes this cordoned off area. In this book, it's the fictional Midwest U.S. city of Bologna that's been isolated by some unexplained cataclysm. I don't know. But the residents there are very much on their own. Except unlike the zone, Bologna isn't especially dangerous so much as it is a place for people to act out their libertine fantasies. Or at least the libertine fantasies of Samuel R. Delany, which in 1975, when he wrote this book, were substantial. So the mysteries in Dahlgren are just everywhere. I'll give you a flavor of them now. So we want to know, like, who is the main character? Kid, because Kid isn't his real name and he doesn't remember where he came from. You kind of wonder what happened to Bologna to put it in this state. Why are some buildings sometimes on fire and sometimes not, but they never seem to get damaged? Why do some characters drape themselves with these optic chains of prisms, mirrors, and lenses? And why are all these folks who wear these things very hesitant to talk about them? Why is the accused rapist named George Harrison? And why is he one of the nicest people in the novel? Why did a second moon appear in Bologna's sky one night? Why did an enormous sun rise one morning, taking up half the horizon, only to sink back down again? And why do some characters wear red contact lenses? And why do they always terrify kid? And not least of which here is, why does the book Dahlgren itself end where it began, making it a circular text like Joyce's Finnegan's Wake? Delaney himself described the novel's structure as a Necker cube, so maybe that's a clue. That's just a few of the mysteries in this book. A lot of good stuff there. I love books like these that you find yourself thinking about again and again, usually at 3 a.m. But this idea of natural anomalies triggered something else in my mind, which I'm sure younger listeners have already thought of. And that is the so-called SCP Foundation, which is pretty hard to summarize, but I'll give it a try. So the SCP Foundation is, at its root, a collaborative writing project about a fictional organization devoted to cataloging paranormal oddities. So SCP stands for Secure, Contain, Protect. So these contributors put a lot of effort into crafting these sort of dry academic descriptions of truly nutty things, which are sometimes comedic, sometimes bordering on horror. You can spend hours browsing these on their website. Some of it's pretty goofy, but some is intriguing and really well done. And there's an element of multimedia too, since contributors are encouraged to submit art and photos, many of them doctored in creative ways. And it sort of reminds me of an even older collaborative internet thing. Does anyone remember the site Catalog of UK Entrances to Hell? I mean, this is still up, amazingly. I did just check it before recording this. The gist here is that people would take pictures of seemingly random things around the UK countryside, like maybe an old walled-over stone arch or a rusted doorway or a hole under a tree or just a random pile of trash. They'd give it a clever name and a description of how it was a portal to hell, along with various particulars and quirks, and just tons of hilarious, unexplained references to other aspects of hell. It's just good stuff, very funny, and a good predecessor to the whole SCP thing. So the artifacts and phenomena in Roadside Picnic are definitely in the vein of SCPs, so if that site appeals to you, definitely check out this book. So having read Roadside Picnic, I turned my attention to its film adaptation, Stalker. And it helped that a friend of mine, EF1J, recently had the opportunity to watch this in an actual theater and spoke very highly of it. So Lord knows there were no theaters carrying this movie around where I live, so I just happened to catch it online one night. And it turns out the cover of my book is from the film. I found Stalker to be interesting in a 70s foreign art film sort of way. I thought its incredibly long shots were so still and quiet that it made Stanley Kubrick seem like Michael Bay. In fact, this movie is 2.5 hours long, which maybe isn't completely nuts by today's standards, but it was pretty unfathomable in 1979. So much so that it was issued in 2 parts, which I think was largely a result of Tarkovsky's struggles with his cinematographers, who had half-lives not unlike that of a drummer from Spinal Tap. He really went through them. And I think making a longer film in 2 parts was the answer, as counterintuitive as that might seem. The version I saw did have Russian dialogue and English subtitles, and despite the turnover in cinematographers, it looked astoundingly good. I was immediately just struck by the sepia tones in the intro, not black and white, but sepia, which gradually transition to ordinary color when the characters leave civilization and enter the zone, which is kind of opposite of what I would expect. You know, I would expect real life to be in color and the zone to look unusual. So I don't know, maybe that's a subtle commentary that real life in the Soviet Union in 1979 was worth escaping. I don't know, hard to say. But the colors do change throughout the film, which is interesting. And for sure, the composition and the symmetry of each shot makes it clear that a lot of thought went into camera position, shapes, blocking. I'm kind of reminded of how Kubrick drew storyboards for every shot in the first part of 2001: A Space Odyssey, and I have no doubt that they paid a similar amount of attention here to what all of this looked like in the camera. And I read that they filmed a lot of the zone scenes in an abandoned hydroelectric power plant in Estonia. And I gotta say, each shot is incredibly otherworldly. It's hard to describe, but the cover in this book here gives you an idea. And despite its length, the story of Stalker was actually a vast simplification of Roadside Picnic. So gone is any mention of the aliens or any speculation as to the nature of the zone and the things within. Gone are the artifacts. They're replaced only with the room. And the room, according to word on the street, is a place that can grant any wish, much like the Golden Sphere in Roadside Picnic. So instead of differing viewpoints between the government and the stalkers, here we only have one stalker, a man who's referred to as such, and he's played by Alexander Kadanovsky, who is just electric here, and his moods range from the brisk efficiency of an experienced soldier to a man at his wit's end, just a hair away from total emotional collapse. And he has a wife, played in equally riveting fashion by Elisa Friendlich, who is not too fond of her husband's career choices. So in a nutshell, what happens in the movie is two other characters hire the stalker to take them into the zone and to the room. You have the writer, played by Anatoly Solnitsyn, who was a regular in Tarkovsky's films, and then you have the professor, played by Nikolai Grinko. And each has their own motives, which come out in their dialogue throughout the course of the film. And again, I'm not going to spoil it, but the movie is a deep dive into human motivation, our sense of self-worth, and our faith for a better future. I did find the film enjoyable, if a little tedious by today's standards, but it's not unlike some other tedious films that I've nevertheless enjoyed. And no, I'm not talking about Avengers Endgame. One that did come to mind while watching Stalker was this, Daft Punk's Electroma. Yes, Daft Punk, purveyors of the French house music genre of the early noughts, and of course, increasingly elaborate robot masks. So Daft Punk made 3 original films. In fact, Electroma was the third. And they did it more or less as an afterthought following their third album, Human After All. So this movie is a mere 72 minutes, less than half of Stalker, but unlike Stalker, it features no dialogue at all. Instead, it's shot after shot of the main characters either driving or walking across the landscape, saying nothing. So why on earth did I like this movie? Why would anyone watch it? Well, first of all, because it's Daft Punk, obviously, so you know there's going to be something good here. And really, a bit more happens than what I just described. In fact, Electroma does have a plot of sorts. See, it takes place in a sort of mirror image world where everyone is a robot, and more to the point, everyone is a robot that looks like one of the 2 members of Daft Punk. And all of these folks secretly dream of being human. The difference for the 2 protagonists is that they have a plan for becoming human, one that doesn't really go as they expect, which leads to startling repercussions. And again, I'm not going to spoil it here. I first watched this thing on the internet a few years after it came out, and I watched it perfectly straight. Well, I might have had a beer or two, but I imagine this is the sort of film that would make a lot more sense, or at least be more enjoyable, with the right kind of stimulant. Not that I'd normally associate Daft Punk with that sort of thing, but Electroma is definitely that sort of film. And it conveys that same sense of empty ennui that we get watching Stalker, on how it's hyper-focused on just a few characters and following them to where they shouldn't go in their quest to achieve some kind of transcendence. Daft Punk managed to do it in less than half the time as Tarkovsky, and one wonders what Tarkovsky would have thought of Daft Punk's Electroma. But alas, he died in 1986, aged just 54. So for those keeping track, that's just 7 years after Stalker, and 7 years before Daft Punk would even form. Seriously though, Tarkovsky did die under mysterious circumstances. It was ostensibly cancer, but Theories vary on whether it was contracted naturally or whether it was the result of shooting Stalker amid toxic runoff, or maybe perhaps some kind of KGB cover-up. But it is really sad, since he was a visionary director, and, 54, let's face it, is just way too young, and I'm not just saying that as someone who's quickly approaching 54. I did enjoy Stalker, though not as much as reading Roadside Picnic. Again, I'm just much more of a book guy than a film guy, and I always prefer the book to the film. In fact, I can't think of a counterexample. I really, right, well, maybe Fight Club. That was definitely better as a film, I guess. And maybe No Country for Old Men. I don't know, if only because I don't like how Cormac McCarthy thinks he's too good to write proper dialogue. And I do love me some Coen brothers, and it's hard to argue that Javier Bardem wasn't a terrifying badass in that flick, despite his haircut. But generally, books over movies. Stalker was enjoyable, but, it scrapped the sci-fi aspects of the story, which for me were the most compelling bit. Instead, it was focused on the human motivations and implications, particularly for the main character, the Stalker, who in the end feels threatened by the reactions of his two companions when they finally reach the room. And, I personally had a hard time squaring the characters' feelings to their actions, particularly the wife, who on one hand was devastated that her husband would choose to risk himself again in the zone, but on the other claimed to prefer a life of danger and uncertainty. And, I realize one has to view all this philosophizing from the fact that it was coming out of the late 70s Soviet Union, a culture that maybe wasn't as free to express their own personal desires as maybe other places in the world at that time. And after all, the Strugatsky's previous novels were all predicated on a world in which communism had succeeded, thereby enabling technological and sociological advancement to the solar system and beyond, which is maybe no worse an assumption of an American author that Western democracy would prevail across the universe, but, a clear indicator that these works were not free of regional ideology. But, personally, when I'm enjoying a work of fiction, I don't care about philosophy. I just want a good story. I want to know that this happens, then this happens, then that happens. Don't make it too clever. I'm not trying to get a damn master's degree here. Make me want to turn the page. I want to find out what happens next. And that's what Roadside Picnic did. It made me want to turn the page. It's a good story. In fact, I want to reread it even though I just read it. It's one of those books that just keeps me guessing, and I think rereading it might fill a few more of those gaps. So a couple episodes ago, I talked about Coyle's album Horse Rotorvator as a puzzle, and that's what Roadside Picnic is to me. It's a puzzle. The same with Dahlgren or Stalker or Electroma. They're things I can turn over and over in my mind like a Rubik's Cube, just looking for a solution. And to me, the best books are like that. In fact, the best stories are like that, regardless of whether they're books, films, or just tales told around a campfire. Well, there you have it, folks. The Strugatsky's Roadside Picnic, the root of a franchise after all, a film, a series of video games, and maybe even a few spiritual successors. It was just a short idea, a seed that grew into a big old tree of burning fuzz that spewed glittering spider webs that, if touched, assured your death in 48 hours. Or something. You're listening to Stronger Than Reason either on YouTube or as an Apple or Spotify podcast, the show that's stumbling into sweater weather. That's right. Mulled cider, corn mazes, warm blankets, early sunsets, long pants, and most of all, the dreaded PSL, potentially soggy leaf piles. You gotta watch out for them, those PSLs. They're everywhere. Soggy leaf piles. Yeah. Potentially soggy. Yeah. As always, I thank you for listening, and until next time, stay strong.